Right. Thanks everyone for joining today. Jeremy and I are really excited to be working with the Oregon Wine Board to put together these sessions for you. Today we're going to be going over the Accounting 201 session. I really hope you find it helpful. To give you a little background, my name is Casey Johnson. I'm a cost accounting specialist with Crafted ERP. I spent my career working in a lot of operational accounting, going over inventory management, building out your cost structure, and really understanding what your profit margins are. Jeremy King is not able to join us today. He is a principal with Crafted ERP and is currently traveling to the Unified Wine Symposium. But he started his career in investment banking, eventually becoming the CFO of a publicly traded software company. After leaving corporate finance, he began to work for a technology and management consulting practice. It was while there that he had the idea for Crafted ERP. To give you a little background on what Crafted ERP is, it's an industry solution built on NetSuite to help businesses in the beverage industry manage their inventory and accurately report financials. So we're really excited to help work with the Oregon Wine Board to go over costing and really help you understand how we're going to build these costs and understand the profitability of your vineyard. So to go over the agenda for today, I know last time we covered a lot of that EBITDA and the balance sheet income statement information that Bree mentioned on. So today what we're going to be going over is developing a costing model, how we're going to be applying overhead costs to this costing module, really looking at aging costs, finding ways to identify major cost drivers and if there's any potential for savings. We're also going to be reviewing your profitability. So we really want to understand how profitable your vineyard is and if there's any room for savings. So as we go over this costing model progression, and the Costing 101 webinar, if you were able to join, we really honed in on what are the material costs that are making up the final case product, our final case goods wine costs. So we really focused on columns 3 and 4 to say, what are our vineyard materials? How much is our fruit costing us? Any sort of winemaking materials or cellar materials, those packaging materials, and building on that to get into our case good inventory. So as we progress through this, we're going to be working backwards into these 1 and 2 columns today, gathering a lot of those labor costs. How are we going to capture our vineyard labor? And then how are we going to assign that to a specific varietal so that we know the true cost of what that final case of wine costs us? Again, looking at overhead, so outside of labor, what other costs is it taking in order to manage the vineyard, maintain the vineyard, and really produce the best grapes that we can. Now, if we're purchasing fruit, we're going to be looking at additional costs that we might want to add to that purchased fruit. So we'll be looking at our landed costs. Is there any freight associated with acquiring this inventory? Are there any other costs handling of the goods that we need to consider to really capture the total value of that grape inventory? Next, we'll go into the winemaking. So looking at those press factors, any labor associated there to really get down to that new bulk wine cost before we go through the aging process, and the storage of the cellar labor, any materials added there, overhead for facilities of the storage, and then looking at that blended wine final cost, where again, we're going to have another factor of the evaporation. So as we go through the process, we really want to make sure, we're capturing all the value of these things, but then we're also capturing that natural loss in the quantity of materials that we have on hand. And so then we'll get into the final portion where we go into that packaging. So we have our blended bulk wine. How do we get this into the bottle, out to our customers? What is that final cost to our customer? And really understanding the profitability of that. So to go through and look at it in more of a numbers aspect, we're going to start at the top of gathering that total grape cost, whether they're purchased or whether we're harvesting them ourselves and we're having to add in that labor and overhead to get to the total value of what that grape varietal cost us. Then when we get to that press factor, one of the main things we want to make sure is that while we know we're going to reduce the total weight or volume of a product that we now have on hand, we want to keep the value the same. So for example, if you start with 1,000 tons of wine and the 1,000 tons of wine costs you X amount of dollars, we want to make sure that after that press factor is considered and you have less tons, you still have the same value in your inventory and your financials. And we're going to go through the same process once we get past that press factor of adding any additional materials past that step, labor associated with it, and overhead to get the total cost of our aged wine, at which point we want to consider that evaporation factor. So if we go back to that previous example, if we have 1,000 gallons of wine on hand, and in those 1,000 gallons cost us $3,000, we might say we expect a 2% evaporation factor to be considered here. So we might lose 20 gallons of wine through evaporation that we know is a natural process. And so while we no longer have those 20 gallons, that 980 gallons that we still have on hand is going to remain at that $3,000 value. So we want to make sure that we're capturing and holding on to that value as we go through this process to really understand our cost of goods. After that step, we're going to look into our packaging materials, labor, and any overhead associated with packaging to get our final total cost of that wine production. So if you were a part of the Costing 101 webinar, you already saw this slide. This is where we just start gathering those material costs and everything we need to consider. So we want to look at our grape varietals and how much money does that specific varietal cost us, whether we harvested it or purchased it. Then going into the next step of that, we're looking at bulk wine. If we purchased in those grapes or harvested those grapes ourselves, considering that pressing factor to get to our new quantity on hand and value. If we're purchasing any bulk wine in to blend or whatever the status is with that, what the true value of that is, and adding any landed costs. And then we also want to be looking at our packaging materials. So capturing what are we purchasing our bottles for, corks, cases, labels. And just really building on those material costs. So once we have all of those materials, the next area that we want to start looking at and bucketing these into are our landed costs, our labor, and our overhead. So when we bring up landed costs, what we're talking about is anything that it costs you in acquiring that inventory. So if you are purchasing in grapes, you want to consider, are you being charged freight separately for that purchase? Are you transporting them yourselves? Or is that freight cost included in the price that you're purchasing them for? If that freight is a separate line item on the invoice, you want to make sure that you include that in the total value of your grapes, along with any sort of duties and fees. So if you're importing, if there's any sort of duties and fees associated with your bottles, with your cases, with the grapes themselves, you want to make sure that we're applying this to the total value of our inventory to get the true cost of goods. And so landed costs will not only be on the purchase side, but it will be on any sort of transfer that you have. So if you are harvesting the grapes yourself and you need to transfer that inventory to a separate location in order for the pressing process to occur, we want to make sure that when we do that transfer, we add in those additional freight costs, or if you have those trucks in your inventory, the labor that you might be paying the driver in order to move that product from one location to another. The next area that we want to look at is labor. So we want to be capturing what our total labor is. If we're harvesting the grapes ourselves, we want to be capturing what is our vineyard labor. How much labor are we spending from the time the beginning of season to the end of the season to maintain this vineyard? And then again, once we get into that aging process, the pressing processes, we want to be capturing the labor along the way so that we can make sure that we're still building that into our cost at each stage of the process. Then the third area that we're going to look into is our overhead. So if you're looking at harvesting the grapes, is there any sort of fertilizer or anything that you're using in your vineyard that you want to capture the cost of that's needed in order for that grape production to happen? Then when we get into the storage facilities, are you renting a building? If you're renting that building, we want to make sure that we're capturing that as part of the storage cost. If you own the building, you might potentially have some insurance that you're paying on this building or other costs associated with the maintenance of this building that we'll want to make sure that we're including in this cost, because this is a direct cost related to having this storage facility for this inventory that you're producing. Along with that, you're going to have your utilities of the building, building those in. Any sort of maintenance with your equipment, again, that maintenance is a required feature or process in order to get the grapes from point A into the bottle point B so that you can have this building cost along the way. Storage is another area that we see big in overhead, especially if you're using third-party storage facilities for potentially your case wine or if you have any barrel aging. So just making sure that we are able to gather and capture all of those costs. So now when we start looking into allocating the overhead of these costs, we're going to start at the excuse me, we're going to start at the vineyard level. So for this example, we're using our labor expense. So if it takes $15,000 over a period of time to, if it costs us $15,000 over a period of time in labor in order to maintain our, one second, our vineyard, we want to make sure that we're applying that cost correctly so that we can get that down to the varietal level that we discussed at the beginning when we're looking at our material costs. And the main way that we see this done is based on planted acreage of your blocks. So we see these costs allocated down to the block level to capture which varietals this applies to. So for this example, if we're looking at planted acreage, and block A has 2.1 planted acres, we're assuming that the labor that is required to maintain that block is 39% of the total labor based on the total planted acreage of 5.4 for this vineyard. So 39% of that $15,000 is going to be just over $5,800 of labor in order to maintain block A. So how do you capture this is a big question that is next. How do you gather this information? So there's a few ways to do it. The main way that we see this done is with a custom general ledger segment. And this is going to depend on how advanced your financial systems are and whether that's allowed. So when I say a custom general ledger segment, a lot of times when you're looking at general ledger segments, for example, department is a very popular segment that people use. So if you look at departments, it's usually defining expense categories. So your accounting department, your administrative department, your IT department. So what companies will do is they'll have one general ledger account for payroll expense, and then they'll have a separate segment that defines that out to departments. So what we do here is we have a single labor expense category that is related to our agricultural labor of that vineyard. And then at the end of each month, each quarter, each period, we do an allocation to push that down to the block level so that at the end of harvest, you can pull up that general ledger segment and account and say, how much did we spend in labor? How much did we spend in maintenance? How much did we spend in any other activities in order to maintain this block? And we usually use planted acreage as a good indicator of how much effort it is to maintain that block as an estimate. Trying to gather this information very specifically down to the block level would be very difficult, but when we're using that planted acreage, you tend to get a larger harvest out of there. It spreads out that value more evenly and in a more reasonable fashion across the acres. So what do you do if you don't have that general ledger segment, that specialized segment for block? How else can you capture this information? So there's a few ways that I've seen this done. A few companies will break this down into specific general ledger accounts. So instead of having, for this example, one labor expense account, you would have three: labor expense block A, block B, block C. And it kind of just depends on how much workload and how much capacity your team has in order to be able to do these things. Because sometimes maintaining a general ledger with that many accounts can get very difficult, because usually it's not just 3 blocks that you're managing on your vineyard. It's usually 20, 30, 40, or however many that could be. So breaking it out at that level can be difficult. You can also just keep it grouped into that one expense account and do this manually out in Excel. So at the end of the harvest, you go through and say, what was our total planted acres this year? What was our total labor expense? And just start building out those categories and groups to then say, okay, how much of this block's varietal was put into the finished goods cost of wine, and so how much of this portion do I need to attribute to that value in each case of wine. So once we gather all of those costs associated with our farming, we can get a real cost of what it costs us to harvest that grape, that specific varietal. And that's so important because then it tells you how effectively your vineyard and your farming operation is working. It's very good afterwards once you've gathered all that cost to go out into the market and say, what would it have cost me to acquire these same grapes, these like a very similar quality of grape, same varietal, what would it have cost me if I had tried to purchase these? And that'll give you a good indication of how effectively your farming operation is working. Obviously, if it's costing you significantly more and you could go out into the market and purchase a similar quality varietal, it's now time to start diving deeper into those costs to say, why did it cost me so much to produce in this block? What specific drivers were there? Was it a difficult season for me in terms of weather? Had to use a little more labor. What is causing it to be higher? If you're going out and you're saying, gosh, it's going to cost me a ton more if I wanted to purchase these out in the market, your farming operation, your vineyard is doing great, keep it up, but it's always important to give you sort of that benchmark of how you're doing. That way you can always constantly be looking for ways to improve. So once we've gotten through that gathering of our grape cost, our estimation of our press factor, we're really going to want to start looking at those aging costs. So we know once we have the wine pressed, if we're not just bottling it and sending it out to the customer, we're going to have it in storage, whether that's barrels or tanks, it's still going to need to be maintained. So understanding what is the total labor over the period that it's in storage, over the period that it's being aged, any sort of maintenance involved. And if you're using tanks, there's usually going to be regular maintenance involved in making sure everything is sanitary, you're good to go. And then also those storage costs. So if you're using a third-party storage facility, or even if you're using your own storage facility, what insurance are you paying on the building? What are the utilities to get that climate control in place that you might be using to make sure that your wine is aging at the best possible, in the best possible conditions? And then we also want to be considering that evaporation factor. So we know there's going to be some loss during this aging process, but how do we capture how much loss there actually was? And how do we make sure that we keep the value of the wine the same? So we want to make sure as we're going in and potentially transferring barrels into others to consider that evaporation factor, that we're consuming that quantity into the wine and consuming that value, but our output is going to be less for each time we have that evaporation factor that we're considering. So now to get into cost drivers and savings. So one of the major areas that we look for when we're talking about cost drivers and savings is freight. So anytime we're touching or moving inventory, there's always going to be a cost associated with it. And I put transfer loss afterwards because that's also a potential area where we can lose some of that value in our inventory that we can look to maintain in the future. So if we're looking at freight, looking at what it's costing to acquire grapes if you're acquiring them, if you're transferring any sort of inventory from one location to another, how many touches are you having on this inventory? Is there a potential room to streamline your supply chain and really capturing that overall freight expense? Right now, the trucking industry is in a shortage of drivers, which is driving up freight costs. So the demand is there, the supply is very low. So this is one area where it's very good to understand what the costs of your freight are and if there's any room for improvement. If you need all of these touches, if you need all of these movements, are you using the most cost-effective and reliable carriers? Could you potentially look at bringing some of this in-house? Also, are you planning far enough in advance so you're not getting any sort of additional fees for short notice of getting these transfers in place? It's just a great place to be able to dive in and get the details on what it's actually costing you to move this inventory. Transfer loss is another place. So again, anytime we're moving product, there's a chance that we're going to lose some of them. If you're coming out of a tank and into a truck, chances are you're not going to get as much out of the tank and into the truck and then back out of the truck as you started with. So just making sure that every time we're moving product, it's a necessary and intentional move. Is there value in transferring the grapes to be pressed at another location? Is the cost effectiveness of doing that worth it over you pressing the grapes yourself? Should you be looking into other factors and being able to do that? The next area is labor costs. So your labor costs are always going to be a significant portion of your cost of goods. So we all want to pay our employees well, make sure that they're happy, they're well deserving, they're hard workers. So it's not so much how we can cut costs in labor, but making sure at the very least we understand why we're having these labor costs. If your labor costs year over year are continuing to increase while your revenue stays stagnant, you need to understand, why that's happening, how you can then capitalize on that labor cost to increase your revenue instead of having that cut into your margins. Understanding, if it's a down year, do you potentially need to look at adjusting your labor force and saving some money there. Just really understanding what your labor costs are, if they're necessary, if they're adding that value to your wine. And then maintenance is going to have a similar sort of story. If your maintenance is increasing, if your maintenance expenses are increasing and your revenue is staying the same, is it time to look into new equipment? Are you having all of these maintenance issues because you have some aged tanks, you need to redo the trellis or irrigation system that's potentially costing you more money in the short term, and you could be investing in new equipment that will help you along the way? So while you might incur that big expense or that big cash out in order to update your equipment, along the lines, is there your return on the investment in this equipment going to be valuable? Because that's really where you need to make sure that anything you're investing in is going to give you that ROI. It's going to help cut down your maintenance costs in the future. All right, so how does this all play together? So we want to make sure that as we're gathering all of these costs, getting the true case cost of our wine, that at the end of the day, each varietal, each blend, each finished wine, it's profitable. And as we dive in and start allocating these costs down to the block level, capturing our labor along the way, looking at, how much of a planted acreage one varietal is and attributing the cost based on that, we can get down to a more accurate case good cost of our wine. For that example we looked at earlier between A, B, and C, they all had a different planted acreage. So if I apply the same amount of labor costs to each of those blocks, it's going to be unfair to the block that has the lower acreage because they probably didn't incur that much labor. So when you look at that finished goods case, you might say, wow, I'm not making any money on this finished good, when in actuality, it could be your most profitable wine. And one of your other wines that you're not applying a labor cost to fairly enough could potentially be dragging you down and holding back those margins. And it's better to dig into that sooner. So one of the first things we want to make sure we're doing is we want to make sure that we're setting goals. When we're looking at our varietals and our cases is, what do we want our profit margins to be as a whole at the end of the day? Also, are there different profit margins between different types of wine? And how can I compare that to what I'm selling my wine for and what my profit margins are? So as we're setting these sort of profit margin goals, it's important to be able to estimate what the total cost of our wine is. I know, especially if you're harvesting the grapes yourself, sometimes those costs don't come in real time. So you'll get invoices for third party later, a few months labor, a few months after that occurs. So really making sure that we have a good estimate for what we think it's going to cost us to produce. And then as that information comes in, we're able to adjust our estimate based on actuals. So estimating out that material cost, getting that press factor in there to see what our total final quantity is with our new value, adding in that labor and overhead, making sure we understand those evaporation rates to understand the total quantity that we'll have remaining to get to that calculated estimated cost per case. Then as we have those materials come in, say your harvest wasn't as plentiful as you thought, you want to purchase grapes in order to make up for this, adjusting that and understanding the impacts. Was this a good decision? Is this going to be valuable based on the industry and the demand currently? Should you be purchasing in grapes, or should you potentially just take that harvest that you have? Getting that press factor, adjusting your labor rates. No one can predict the weather. There's a lot of things that will impact your labor and your overhead costs throughout the season. So while these estimates are probably going to be, well, not probably, your estimates are not going to be accurate, but we want to get as close as possible. We want to make sure that as we make these adjustments, we're able to say, here's what impacted it this year, here's what impacted this season, so we can start building those trends and hopefully get a better estimate year over year. And then after we get done with getting that actual cost of our wine per case, we make our price per case less our actual cost per case, divide it by that price per case to get our margin to say, did we meet our goals? Was it as expected? A lot of times what we see as we start diving into this and allocating these costs down to the block level, really diving in and getting a better estimate of what our wine costs us, there's a lot of surprises that come out of this. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're great. Overall, you're looking at your financials and you're profitable, but it's really good to know based on those specific wines that you're selling, which ones are really your good money makers and which ones potentially you have room for improvement on, or potentially you need to look at reworking depending on what your end goals are. You might have some wines that you're trying to mass distribute that you might be expecting a lower profit margin on. So just being able to see whether that's true or not, while you have some that are going to be smaller batch, a select vintage, that you're going to expect higher margins, and making sure that those smaller batch wines are going to be as profitable as you expect in order to get really the return on all of that effort you're putting in. But this time I'd like to open it up to questions. I put my email address on the bottom along with Jeremy King, and then our LinkedIn is there also, so I'd love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. Bree, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Casey. That was fantastic modeling. And we don't have any direct questions except where can we find the recaps? And these recaps will be posted on the industryoregonwine.org site, along with the Profit Planner and the links to the Profit Planner. We should have this webinar up hopefully by the end of today, if not within 24 hours. So please look for the 101 and 201 series there. And again, register for the 301 session, which is coming up at Symposium next Wednesday at 3 p.m. And we might see if we can also convince Casey to do a recap of the 301 session later in the month. Casey, yeah, there's a question. Are you placing cost of label design in overhead?
Yes. So the label design, I would put that into almost a landed cost of your label. I guess let me take a step back and make sure that I'm answering this fully. So your label design, depending on how many years you're using that over, might be easier to just expense. If this is a 1 year, 2 year label that you know how long you're going to be using that specific label and design for, you can either apply it to that specific wine that you're using for. Again, depending on the expense that it is, you can capitalize that into inventory and recognize it over a specific period. So it's kind of a difficult question to ask, just depending on, if you're planning to use this label for 10 years, you can apply it to that wine cost over 10 years. And at any point in time, if you wanted to change, you just have to expense and write off that amount at the moment. A lot of those questions sometimes depend on the value of what that design costs you, and then it might be good to discuss it with a tax accountant too, as far as when and where to recognize that expense.
I would agree with that. Thanks, Casey. Another question was, how are you handling cost of case storage over time when a vintage has been released?
So the way that we handle that in the system that we're using is we capitalize that storage based on what you still have on hand. So just understanding that that's still part of the cost of having that wine available, especially depending on what your sales team is planning to sell. I think it's important for them to understand what those storage costs are in order for it to sit on your books. The way we're able to do that is we just run basically a self-consumption production order at the end of each month to add additional costs to that inventory that's still sitting on hand.
Great. I think that's all of the questions that have come through. Again, Casey can be reached at casey@craftederp.com if anyone has any further questions. And she and Jeremy will also be at the Oregon Wine Symposium next Wednesday afternoon with the 301 seminar. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing Casey and the Crafted team at the symposium. And again, the reviews of these webinars will be available on the Oregon Wine Industry website, linked to the Profit Planner calculator. Thanks, and we'll see you next week at Symposium.